1. Should the U.S. Department of Education be abolished? 2. Trump's big beautiful bill, how it could radically change public schools. 3. U.S. Department of Education dismantling. What's next for American schools? 4. Why 175-plus Democrats are suing to save the Department of Education. 5. The crisis in public education. What happened to bipartisan support? 1. Should the U.S. Department of Education be abolished? Shocker. A 4,000-person federal agency that writes no lesson plans and teaches 0 students is hanging on by a thread, yet may cost us local control of our own schools. The U.S. Department of Education sits in a strange twilight zone. Candidate-turned-president Donald Trump promised to swing the axe and eliminate what he called needless bureaucracy. Teachers' unions and their Democratic allies swore they would block him at every turn. So far, the administration has reassigned duties, trimmed the payroll by roughly half, and even packed some employees off with buyouts, only to watch judges order many of them rehired. Translation: the agency is limping, not dead. Why do so many people want it gone? Let's start with the money. Of the roughly $1.15 trillion America spent on schooling during the 2012 to 2013 year, about 92% came from state, local, or private pockets. In other words, the folks who actually run classrooms and purchase textbooks are doing so without much federal cash. Even the department itself concedes its role is modest. But here's where it gets controversial. Critics argue the department is not merely redundant. It may be unconstitutional. The Constitution lists the federal government's powers, and education never made the cut. Thomas A. Berry of the Cato Institute says officials have no authority to carry out programs that were never enumerated, period. And this is the part most people miss. The department was created by Congress in 1979 as a political reward. Jimmy Carter needed the National Education Association support, promised a separate agency, and voila, delivered. Ever since, unions have treated the department like a prized possession, using its rulemaking and grant-writing muscle to nudge states and districts into compliance. One Harvard Education magazine writer likened that influence to a soft but considerable federal steering wheel. Frederick Hess of the American Enterprise Institute adds a practical twist. Those 4,000 employees mainly process student loans and paperwork. They run no schools, teach no classes, and could be replaced by smaller offices inside other agencies, or, better yet, by state-level solutions. The Trump team has tried to do exactly that. Repurpose functions, close offices, and hand pink slips to more than 1,300 staffers. Yet almost every action winds up in court. 2 federal judges have already forced the administration to restore laid-off employees, although a recent Supreme Court ruling clipped the wings of nationwide injunctions, giving the White House fresh hope. Still, separating an agency from life support requires Congress, because only Congress can repeal the very law that created the department. Several bills are waiting in the wings. Senator Rand Paul's A Bill to Terminate the Department of Education and Representative Thomas Massey's identical House version would shut the doors on December 21, 2026. Senator Mike Round's Returning Education to Our States Act and Representative Nathaniel Moran's Orderly Liquidation of the Department of Education Act would redistribute existing duties elsewhere. All of those proposals were sidelined while lawmakers wrangled over the administration's marquee, One Big Beautiful Bill Act, a legislative whale that finally reached the president's desk and was signed on Friday. With that monster out of the way, Congress may have the bandwidth to think about slimming government instead of inflating it. Bold question: if the Department of Education teaches no one, spends money that largely comes from elsewhere, and may violate the Constitution, why keep it? Maybe you think federal oversight prevents inequality. Maybe you believe local innovation works better without Washington's interference. Either way, the stakes are enormous. National control over curriculum, testing, and student loans versus decentralized experimentation and autonomy. So where do you stand? Should Congress pull the plug, or would that plunge schools into chaos? Fire away in the comments. Agreement, disagreement, and every gray area in between. The The real debate starts now. 2. Trump's big beautiful bill. How it could radically change public schools. A seismic shift in federal policy is poised to reshape America's public schools, potentially altering the educational landscape for millions of vulnerable children. But here's where it gets controversial. President Trump's signature legislative achievement, dubbed the Big, Beautiful Bill, triggers sweeping changes that extend far beyond tax reform. This comprehensive legislation slashes funding for essential health and nutrition programs, while dramatically expanding immigration enforcement and subsidizing private education, creating a perfect storm of challenges for public schools. Let's unpack what this means for students and educators nationwide. The bill's deep Medicaid cuts threaten critical health services in schools. Since Medicaid funds school nurses, counselors, and therapists, rural districts, where enrollment is highest, face impossible choices. Picture this. A speech therapist serving disabled children might be cut, or a school nurse covering multiple buildings could be eliminated entirely. Without this funding, schools serving low-income communities risk becoming health deserts for students who need care most. Food security takes another hit through revised SNAP rules. Hundreds of thousands of families could lose nutritional assistance, automatically disqualifying their children for free school meals. Here's the ripple effect. Hungry students struggle to concentrate, attendance drops, and schools lose federal meal reimbursements. Low-income districts may face paperwork avalanches as families scramble to re-qualify, all while cafeterias see more empty seats. Meanwhile, the bill allocates $44 billion for immigration enforcement. School administrators in immigrant-heavy areas already report increased student anxiety and absenteeism during IC operations. Research from Stanford reveals attendance plummets during raids, especially among young children who fear coming home to empty houses. This funding surge risks turning schools into trauma zones rather than safe havens. The legislation's private school subsidy, tax credit scholarships, sparks fierce debate. Supporters cheer expanded parental choice, but critics argue it drains resources from public systems. And this is the most contentious part. With no spending cap, this program could divert billions from public coffers. States may reject it, but where implemented, public schools serving disadvantaged communities stand to lose the most. While workforce Pell Grants for job training offer a silver lining, the updated child tax credit excludes many low-income families. Unlike pandemic-era expansions that lifted millions from poverty, this version leaves behind households with little to no income, widening inequality gaps in education access. Education experts warn of cumulative consequences: fewer health professionals in buildings, rising classroom hunger, attendance crises in immigrant communities, and resource gaps between public and private institutions. Supporters claim efficiency and choice. Opponents see systemic abandonment of public responsibility. What's your take? Does this bill empower families or endanger educational equity? Share your perspective below. We're debating this daily in our newsroom. 3. U.S. Department of Education dismantling. What's next for American schools? The push to dismantle the U.S. Department of Education has faded into the background, but the stakes couldn't be higher for millions of students. What started as a bold initiative under the Trump administration has since lost momentum, even as the department continues to shape policies that affect classrooms nationwide. So, what's really happening behind the scenes, and why does it matter to you? In March, President Donald Trump signed an executive order aimed at dismantling the U.S. Department of Education, a move that sparked both celebration and concern. Yet, despite this high-profile effort, recent actions from the department suggest business as usual, with new projects tackling issues like gender ideology in federally funded curricula and prioritizing Title IX investigations. But here's where it gets controversial. While some see this as a necessary step toward local control, others warn of devastating consequences for vulnerable students. The silence from federal officials on the department's future has left many wondering what's next. As a spokesperson for the Arizona Education Department put it, there has been very little updated news from the federal government on the status of the U.S. Department of Education. This lack of clarity only fuels the debate. Republicans have long argued that the Department of Education is an unnecessary layer of bureaucracy, draining taxpayer dollars while overstepping into state and local education decisions. This perspective has gained traction among conservative parents who want more say in their children's schooling. But this is the part most people miss. Dismantling the department isn't just about cutting red tape. It's about who gets left behind. Leslie Babinski, a research professor at Duke University's Sanford School of Public Policy, warns that the impact could be staggering. We're looking at 7.4 million students with disabilities who rely on funding through the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, she explains. And let's not forget the 9.8 million students in rural schools who depend on federal support to bridge funding gaps in communities with limited tax bases. This isn't just policy, it's people's lives. If the department is dismantled, states may not prioritize these groups, leaving them without critical resources. Yet, Secretary of Education Linda McMahon has reassured the public that federal funding for key programs won't disappear. The president has been clear, dismantling the Department of Education does not mean defunding these programs, she stated. That money is appropriated by Congress, and parents, teachers, and students should not be worried. But is this promise enough to ease concerns? On the other side of the debate, critics argue the department is bloated and ineffective. Tom Horne, Arizona State Superintendent of Public Instruction, doesn't mince words. Shutting down the U.S. Department of Education would not result in a loss of federal formula funding for Arizona. In fact, the department's track record speaks for itself. National test scores in reading, writing, and math have declined over the past 40 years under its watch. Why keep funding a bureaucracy that isn't delivering results? The criticism doesn't stop there. A report from the White House Office of Management and Budget revealed that more than half of the department's employees don't even show up to the office. Horne calls it hopelessly ineffective, adding, "This is a waste of taxpayer dollars and sets a terrible example for educators and students who show up every day." If we're serious about academic excellence, we need to rethink where this money is going. So where does this leave us? The White House and the Department of Education have yet to respond to inquiries about whether dismantling the department remains a priority. The question now is, should we eliminate a federal agency that some see as a lifeline for vulnerable students? Or is it time to cut ties with a system that critics argue has failed to deliver? What do you think? Is the Department of Education an essential safeguard for students in need, or an outdated bureaucracy that's long overdue for reform? Share your thoughts. This conversation is far from over. 4. Why 175-plus Democrats are suing to save the Department of Education. Imagine a country where access to quality education is stripped away from millions of students, leaving them without the vital support they need to succeed. This is the alarming reality that over 175 Democratic members of Congress are fighting against, as they file an amicus brief to block the Trump administration's overhaul of the U.S. Department of Education. But here's where it gets controversial. The administration's efforts to dismantle the department have sparked a heated debate about the role of the federal government in education. At the heart of the issue is the question of whether the president has the authority to unilaterally abolish a federal agency, or if that power lies solely with Congress. As Senator Elizabeth Warren boldly states, the law couldn't be clearer. The president does not have the authority to unilaterally abolish the Department of Education. Donald Trump is not a king, and he cannot single-handedly cut off access to education for students across this country. Warren, along with ranking committee members Jamie Raskin, Bobby Scott, and Rosa DeLauro, is leading the charge against the administration's plans, which they argue violate the separation of powers and lack constitutional authority. The lawmakers' brief is in support of the NAACP's suit against the government, which argues that downsizing the department through a workforce reduction and terminating statutory grant programs would have devastating consequences for students, educators, and schools. And this is the part most people miss. The administration's recent decision to pause over $6 billion in congressionally appropriated education programs ahead of the school year has only added fuel to the fire. The National Education Association, NEA, and a coalition of groups have filed a preliminary injunction, seeking a remedy for the harm inflicted on students, educators, and schools. As Raskin condemns the administration's efforts to curb public education, he emphasizes that Congress created the Department of Education to ensure that every student in America could obtain a high-quality, free public school education. This is the right of every citizen and an essential democratic safeguard against political tyranny. But what do you think? Should the president have the power to unilaterally abolish a federal agency, or is that a decision that should be left to Congress? The power to reorganize the executive branch belongs to Congress, and the brief argues that only Congress has the authority to create, restructure, and abolish federal agencies. Representative Joe Negus warns that closing the department would strip vital support from tens of millions of students and teachers, leaving them without the resources they need to succeed. As the Supreme Court is expected to weigh in on a Massachusetts case that could decide the fate of the department, one thing is clear: the fight to save the Department of Education is far from over. The brief is part of Warren's larger Save Our Schools campaign, which she started after Trump signed an executive order to diminish the Department of Education. The federal government has invested in our public schools, Warren says. Taking that away from our kids so that a handful of billionaires can be even richer is just plain ugly, and I will fight it with everything I've got. As the debate rages on, we want to hear from you. What do you think is the best way to ensure that every student has access to a quality education? Should the Department of Education be abolished? Or is it a vital part of our country's educational system? Let us know in the comments. 5. The crisis in public education. What happened to bipartisan support? In a bold twist to a once united commitment, public education has drastically transformed. Once upon a time, both sides of the political aisle embraced public education as a cornerstone of opportunity and democracy. But here's where it gets controversial. That shared belief appears to be unraveling, as demonstrated by recent drastic changes in budget proposals. For example, the president's current budget, humorously dubbed One Big Beautiful Bill, proposes a staggering $12.4 billion cut to public education, with the most significant portion hitting K-12 schools directly. Over more than 15 years, ensuring every student had an equal shot, regardless of background, was a landmark bipartisan goal. Leaders from both the Republican and Democratic sides believe that a robust public education system was not only key to achieving the American dream, but also essential for sustaining a healthy, forward-thinking democracy. Strong public schools were seen as a strategic investment, underpinning future generations with the knowledge they needed to thrive. Yet, as time has passed, that optimistic consensus seems to be slipping away. So what exactly happened? For 16 years, the nation witnessed a cooperative commitment wherein consecutive administrations from both major political parties prioritized public education. Although their specific policies sometimes sparked vigorous debates, their united vision was clear: every child deserved a quality education. Under President George W. Bush, a bipartisan-supported era began with the passage of the No Child Left Behind Act. This landmark law aimed to boost academic achievement and strengthen accountability, ensuring that no student was overlooked regardless of race, income, or geography. The act set high benchmarks in reading and math, and while it sometimes pushed schools to manipulate metrics to meet standards, it nonetheless spurred modest academic advances and instilled a culture of accountability in education. Critics still raise concerns about No Child Left Behind, arguing that it placed unrealistic demands on under-resourced schools with insufficient funding. However, its fundamental mission, to hold schools accountable for the success of all children, remains a pivotal step forward. Accountability, when combined with adequate support and resources, can indeed drive significant positive change. Fast forward to 2015, when President Barack Obama introduced the Every Student Succeeds Act with broad bipartisan backing. This law shifted more authority back to the states, while still committing to the fundamental principle that every child should learn to read, write, and count. It also promised to provide the necessary resources to meet these expectations, which had long been a mutual priority for both Republicans and Democrats. No significant educational reform has ever managed to pass without this rare cross-party support. However, in recent times, that original spirit of cooperation has diminished. The deeply held belief in public education as the ultimate equalizer is now under intense scrutiny and attack. From instances of book bans to politically motivated curriculum changes, it seems that the shared understanding of public education's role in nurturing both individual success and democratic vitality is breaking down. Adding fuel to the fire, President Joe Biden's administration has spent the last 4 years primarily defending the progress made by previous administrations rather than pushing forward a bold, unified vision for public education. Many of these challenges echo the earlier turmoil experienced during the initial phase of the Trump administration. At what point did we lose faith that every child, no matter their zip code, deserves a high-quality public education? This change in perspective likely began with the most recent presidential elections. We now face a critical crossroads. How can we refocus national attention on ensuring that every student, irrespective of race, income, or location, receives a first-rate education? We must push back by holding Congress accountable and insisting on a renewed commitment to both educational equity and excellence. This means restoring the true meaning of accountability in education, making sure that every child has the fundamental ability to read, write, and perform basic arithmetic proficiently. To achieve this, Congress must reauthorize the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which was last refreshed in 2015. Even as legislative experts deliberate, the immediate priority should be to keep political agendas from interfering in classrooms. The ongoing challenges include standing up against previous administrative overreach and ensuring that current curricular protections remain intact, particularly against attempts to censor books or dictate ideological content. Furthermore, there's an urgent need to bolster investments in teacher preparation programs, especially those designed to recruit and nurture a diverse and high-caliber educator workforce. Equally critical is committing to robust Title I funding in future budgets, which is vital for bridging the gaps in resources among schools and underprivileged communities. Most importantly, Congress should decisively halt any executive actions aimed at undermining public education. They must reject any budget or policy proposals that fail to fortify and invest in our nation's public schools. For 16 years, the bipartisan belief held that public education was essential not just for individual advancement, but for the well-being of our democracy. I firmly believe that the American public will not stand by while a few detractors seek to dismantle this vision. Public education holds immense promise, not only in improving individual life outcomes, but also in fostering robust democratic participation. The time has come to reclaim that shared commitment. How can we begin to restore this vision? Perhaps by urging Congress to reauthorize the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, we can once again embed a true commitment to opportunity and equality at the heart of our educational policy. What do you think about this shift in priorities? Are the current approaches setting us back? Or is there a new strategy that might actually serve our children better? Share your thoughts and join the conversation.